It was a crime that shook Britain. In the dead of night at Queen's Park Hospital, a monster slipped into a children's ward, snatched 3-year-old June Anne Devaney from her cot and carried her off into the darkness. Hours later, she was found brutally murdered within the hospital grounds, and this unspeakable act not only horrified a nation, but also led to the UK's first ever mass fingerprinting operation. A desperate hunt to unmask the killer, and when they found him, the truth was even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Last week we talked about the heartbreaking story of little Emily Holland, a 7-year-old girl from Blackburn who was brutally murdered by the local barber. Her death shook the town, and even today her story still lingers. But what if I told you that that wasn't the only tragedy to haunt those same streets? Just a few miles away, decades later, another innocent life was taken. This time it was 3-year-old June Anne Devaney, and she was snatched from her hospital cot, a place where she should have been safe. And what happened next led to one of the biggest manhunts the UK had ever seen. The shocking part, both killers walked the very same streets, the same town, two devastating stories that Blackburn will never, ever forget. Today we're going to dive into the story of June Anne Devaney, and trust me, this one is going to stay with you forever. On the 5th of May 1948, little June Anne Devaney was just 3 years old when she was admitted to Queen's Park Hospital in Blackburn. She had a mild case of pneumonia, and her parents, Albert and Emily, wanted to make sure she received the very best care. So June went into ward CH3, which she shared with 5 other children, all under the watchful eye of night nurse Gwendolyn Humphreys when their parents left for the day. By May the 14th, June's health had improved significantly, and she was scheduled to go home the next day. In the early hours of the 15th of May, around midnight, Nurse Humphreys was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the children when she heard a boy named Michael Tattersall crying. So she went in to comfort him. She noticed that little June was sound asleep in the cot next to his. Satisfied that everything was okay, she returned to her duties. About an hour later, at 1:20 Nurse Humphreys felt a draft and saw that a porch door at the end of the ward was open. So she went over and closed it, and it was then when she discovered that little June's cot was empty, and panic set in as she noticed adult-sized footprints on the polished floor leading to and from June's cot. A large glass bottle was also found out of place underneath the cot, and despite a thorough search of the hospital, there was no sign of little June. The police were alerted at 1:55 and a search of the hospital grounds started. At 3:17 a.m, Police Constable Parkinson found June's lifeless body near an 8-foot sandstone wall, about 300 feet from the hospital. She was still wearing her nightdress, which was wet and soiled and had suffered severe head injuries. Blood was present on her clothing and on her face, indicating that a violent assault had taken place. The area was immediately cordoned off, with Lancashire officers contacting Scotland Yard and bringing in Detective Chief Inspector John Capstick, who immediately took over the operation. The police knew that this was no ordinary crime. A child had been actually taken from her cot and had been violently beaten to death. Detective Capstick later told the court during the murder trial that the sight of June's corpse would always haunt him. And he's noted to have said, "I am not ashamed to say that I saw that scene through a mist of tears. Years of detective service has hardened me to the many terrible things, but this tiny pathetic body in its nightdress soaked in blood and mud was something no man could ever see and be unmoved by. And it haunts me to this day. And I swore standing there in the rain that I would bring her murderer to justice." Now, the community was left in shock, and a massive investigation was launched to find the perpetrator of this absolutely disgusting crime. Now, a search of the hospital ward revealed some pretty unsettling clues. First off, there were the footprints, faint marks on the polished floor, leading from the children's ward straight to a gap in the perimeter wall near a quarry. It's like something from some horrible nightmare. But the thing that really caught everyone's attention was the glass bottle, a Winchester bottle to be exact, found right under little June's cot, and on it there were fingerprints, 20 of them, plus a palm print. Some were older, but the fresh ones stood out, and the spread of the fingers suggested big hands. Not just big, huge. I mean, we're talking about grown man size of hands, and the police thought they might already have a suspect. Now, just a few days before June was taken, some of the nurses had seen a man lurking outside the ground floor windows of the nursing home. And not just lurking, but he was watching them while they were getting changed. And when they spotted him, he ran away. and the nurses had just called him a peeping Tom. But at the time, no one thought much more of it, not until June was gone. 4 days after the murder, the police tracked this man down, and according to Detective Sergeant Ernest Millen, the guy was, well, not exactly a picture of innocence. He was dirty, dishevelled and unsettling. He admitted to being on the hospital grounds, but he swore he never went anywhere near the children's ward. And then it gets a little bit darker as well. After the police did a physical exam on him, they found a scar in an intimate area, one that could have been caused during a violent sexual attack. So it seemed like the police had their man. But then the new forensic science stepped in. So the prints from the Winchester bottle, they weren't his. They weren't a match. Can you imagine? A man who seemed so guilty had to be released just like that, and the real killer was still out there. The footprints on the floor had told their own terrifying story. The man had crept from cot to cot, pausing at each one, just standing there watching until he chose little June. They knew he'd stood right under her cot. The marks were clear, and at first they thought he'd been barefoot, but then they found something small, a single fibre of red wool. Socks. That thread would prove to be a critical clue. The police were determined. They fingerprinted absolutely everyone, not just the hospital staff, but they fingerprinted the patients, the ambulance drivers, visitors, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, anyone who had set foot in that hospital, which was over 2,000 people, and still they had no match. Now the case was hanging by a thread at this point, but Detective Millen, he couldn't shake the feeling that those prints on the bottle, that big handprint, would be the key. And he was right. So while the police were busy fingerprinting everyone connected to the hospital, a local taxi driver came forward, and he had some information. He told them that around midnight on May the 14th, he picked up a fare in town and later dropped the passenger near the quarry, and he'd watched the man as he'd headed over towards the hospital. But the only detail he could provide about the man was that he had a strong local accent, which wasn't really much to go on, but every little bit helps. The police were piecing together a profile of their suspect. The fingerprints on that bottle suggested a young man, smooth ridges without the wear and tear you'd expect from someone older. And given that World War II had just ended a few years prior, they speculated that he might be an ex-serviceman or a sailor, or possibly someone who'd served abroad. They even sent copies of his fingerprints to places where British troops had been stationed, but they came up empty-handed. Public pressure was mounting. This wasn't just any murder. It was the brutal killing of a 3-year-old girl, and people were scared and they were angry and they were demanding answers. On the 25th of May, the Manchester Evening News published an article saying that 16 school children from Blackburn had to be escorted to school because their parents refused to let them walk alone along a path that would take them through the grounds of the hospital. And that is how much fear was there in the local area at the time, and I can't say that I blame them. Bloodhounds were brought in for a nationwide search, but they turned up absolutely nothing. By this time, Chief Inspector Capstick was feeling the heat, especially since he was also investigating the murder of an 11-year-old boy in nearby Bolton. And initially there were whispers that the two cases might be linked, but there was no evidence to say that there were. Then, on the 16th of May, the Sunday Mirror ran an article about June's murder, appealing directly to the killer to turn himself in before he lost control and struck again. They described him as insane and battling an illness, and I'm not sure that kind of language would really have encouraged someone to come forward. And then by the 20th of May, police decided to take an unprecedented step. They were going to fingerprint every male over the age of 16 who had been in Blackburn on the night of the 14th of May. Now, this was the first time an entire town would undergo such a process, and even the Mayor of Blackburn came out and urged the public to cooperate. And he assured them that all fingerprints would be destroyed after the investigation was finished. And so, Find a Fingerprint was launched. On May the 23rd, 20 detectives, armed with inking pads and fingerprint cards, began the painstaking task of going door to door. Now, Blackburn had around 120,000 residents spread across 35,000 homes, and day after day, week after week, the police collected prints. And by the end of July, over 46,000 sets had been taken, and there was still no match. And frustration was growing, and people were doubting the police's ability to solve the crime. Even Millen and Capstick faced hostility when they took breaks at local pubs, getting shouted at by members of the public. But just when it seemed like they'd hit a dead end, a breakthrough came in early August. The food office in Blackburn, responsible for issuing ration books, provided a list of 900 men who had yet to be fingerprinted. Now, these were individuals who, for some reason, weren't on the electoral register. And on the 12th of August, among a batch of new fingerprint cards sent to Preston, there it was, a match. Card number 46253. The prints were identical to those on the Winchester bottle, and the name on the card? Peter Griffiths of 31 Briley Street, Blackburn. Now, his registration number indicated he was indeed an ex-serviceman, just as the police had suspected from the start. Can you imagine the mix of relief and dread in that moment? 3 long months after the murder, the police finally had their man, but the story wasn't over yet. Now, before we go into the details in the next section of the video, I would like to say that some people might find this information distressing, as it does go into graphic detail of the murder of little June Devaney. Now, Peter Griffiths' prints had been taken on August the 11th, and he was a 22-year-old flour mill packer who handed over his prints without hesitation. Just another formality in the massive investigation, or so it seemed. But when those prints were compared to the ones left on that Winchester bottle in the hospital, the match was undeniable. The fingerprint analysis cry rang through that office. "I've got him! It's here!" That evening, as Griffiths left his house for his night shift, detectives intercepted him. Calmly, they informed him he was wanted for questioning about the murder of June Anne Devaney. And do you know what his response was? It wasn't shock, it wasn't denial. He just simply asked them, "Is it because of my fingerprints?" And once they confirmed it was, he didn't hesitate. "Well, if they are my fingerprints on the bottle," he said, "I'll tell you all about it." So Griffiths went on to describe a night of drinking. Sinking back pint after pint, he had 11 bitters, 2 Guinnesses, 2 double rums, and then he stumbled his way to Queen's Park Hospital. He saw the children sleeping, and then he picked up little June Anne. She was only 3 years old, and he said she put her arms around my neck, and then he walked with her down the hospital field, and then, when she began to cry, he said, "I lost my temper, and then you know what happened," he told the police. But what actually had happened is he'd smashed her tiny head against the boundary wall 4 times. Griffiths claimed he hoped he'd get what he deserved, and the evidence sealed his fate. There were his prints on the bottle, footprints on the ward floor which were a perfect match to his own, and fibres from his red socks were found at the scene. Bloodstains on a suit he'd pawned just days later. Every single thread of evidence pointed directly at him, and the worst part was the autopsy confirmed that little June Anne had suffered unimaginable cruelty. She had multiple skull fractures, extensive internal injuries, bite marks on her body, and she had been violently assaulted before her death. Every wound, every bruise had been inflicted while she was still alive. Can you even imagine? That little girl must have been terrified and in pain, and no one was coming to save her. It actually makes me feel physically sick. Griffiths went on trial on October the 15th. His defence was insanity. The claim was backed by a psychiatrist who pointed to his family history of schizophrenia, but the prosecution were having none of it. Their own expert testified that Griffiths was perfectly sane and he knew that exactly what he was doing. And it took the jury just 23 minutes to find him quite rightly guilty. Mr. Justice Oliver spoke the final words, and he said, "Peter Griffiths, this jury has found you guilty of a crime of the most brutal ferocity, and I entirely agree with their verdict. The sentence of the court is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you suffer death by hanging." Griffiths accepted his fate without appeal, and on November the 19th, 1948, he was led to the gallows at Her Majesty's Prison, Liverpool. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most famous executioner, carried out the sentence, and in the end, justice was done. But was it enough? For little June Anne, a life stolen so cruelly? Can anything really truly ever be enough? 2 weeks after Griffiths' execution, the fingerprints collected during the investigation were publicly destroyed in a mass pulping at a local paper mill. Over 46,000 sets of prints taken from men right across Blackburn were just reduced to nothing. A final chapter to one of the most horrific cases the town had ever seen. But June Anne's memory remains, a reminder of innocence lost and the devastating darkness that some people are actually capable of. And honestly, just sitting here, graveside, when I think about what happened to little June Anne Devaney, it actually breaks my heart. The level of violence used on such a small child is beyond disturbing, and as a mum of 3 girls myself, I can't help but feel a huge ache in my heart when I imagine her last moments, and then thinking about her parents who believed they were doing the right thing by placing her in hospital to recover, only to have to live with the unbearable guilt of not being there to protect her. It is just so unbelievably tragic. It really hits home and makes you realise just how precious and fragile life really is, especially for our little ones. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever heard of the murder of June Anne Devaney before? And what do you think about how justice was served in this case? Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed watching, and please subscribe for more stories from our past, because sometimes the truth is far darker than any fiction book.